the story of a lost neighborhood and of its people who did not want to go.
I don't want no money. I want my home. The old man is old. See how the old man is old? No more. That's enough. I don't want to get out. I said to my two daughters, they don't want to get out because they spend a lot of money. Plenty of money they spend in this place. We not get none to nobody. Never.
Hi, welcome to the West End Video Newsletter. Tonight I'm going to be a little subdued because about 3 months ago in September we had on the show John OConnor. And John, while he was not a real close friend of mine, I knew fairly well, and he was on this show at least 3 times that I know of. I got involved with him with the electric deregulation, and he also did some health care, and he was a big man in environmental circles. He had a company called Greenworks. Well, John OConnor died November 30th, which was just about 5 days ago, and I really felt bad about it. And it seems like the last show we did, we were talking about somebody else who we both knew, Ed Kelly, who ran a couple non-profit groups for him, and we were talking about Ed Kelly, and we sort of eulogized him at the end of the show, which seemed like, now that I look back, it didn't seem strange at the times, but now we were talking about such a nice guy and why he should die so early. And John OConnor, it seems, has passed away too early. He was only 46, and he did a lot of good things. And he put his money where his mouth was. He backed most of these programs with his own cash. He didn't go out and find somebody else's cash and try to, change things with somebody else's money. He put the energy into it, and he also put his own money into it. John was a real nice guy. He started electric deregulation. He fought electric deregulation because he said, everybody out there, this is not right, it's not going to work right. He said, electric deregulation may be right, but this one, the way they're using it now, it's just going to be a disaster for Massachusetts and the country. He was right. Unfortunately, John died, and I feel really bad, and I'm doing this show as a tribute to him. I feel that John's words should be at least heard once again. He said some really great things, and he did some really great things, and his words should be heard at least once more, before he's silenced completely. Maybe we'll air some more of his clips later on, but at least once more on this show anyway. So we have 2 tapes here. We're going to go to a tape now, and John's talking about electric deregulation. He thought electric deregulation was a disaster, and we're going to show that now. I was one of the 10 signers of the electric deregulation petition, and John pushed for it. Him and Ed Kelly. As I said earlier, Ed was a real nice guy too. It seems they both passed away. And let's go to the tape, Joe.
Yeah, this whole issue of energy deregulation was supposed to bring about lower price electric bills. Right. It was supposed to give consumers choice, because the idea of deregulation was that, hey, you're supposed to have a free market. You're supposed to have competitors selling you electricity. If there are true competitors, it's going to lower the price of energy. That was the theory. And it turned out to be a lot of hot air. Deregulation should properly be called remonopolization. I mean, essentially what they've done, they have like close to 1,000 private utility companies across the country. Half the states have put into place energy deregulation plans similar to California. Massachusetts, not exactly a carbon copy, but they make the largest utilities sell their power plants. Well, the money is more in getting the power to your door, not actually, having a coal plant that makes, although there's good money in that as well, if you happen to be in the business side. If you happen to be the little fella getting the bill, it can hurt you if we allow what seemingly is happening across the country, which is the utility companies are now merging. In Massachusetts, we've had 7 privately owned utilities. Fascinatingly enough, we have, I think it's 40 publicly owned smaller utilities, and they tend to have lower priced electricity, and they do a lot better at clean energy systems. But the 7 private utilities, I believe, make up about 85% of the market here in Massachusetts. So the old Boston Edison, Electric, Western Mass Electric, Mass Electric. But now, all the utilities here in Massachusetts and California are starting to merge. So Pacific Gas and Electric bought the two largest coal-fired plants that used to be owned by Mass Electric, and they've bought, I think, the largest share of the utility plants on the market. There's also a French utility that has bought the old Boston Edison plants. But really what's happening is they're all merging. They haven't really offered us consumers choice. Well, energy deregulation had a bunch of false promises. It was supposed to bring about clean energy, and I oppose it because we didn't do enough clean energy. In fact, we've allowed the 5 most polluting power plants to continue without adhering to a kind of strict interpretation of the Clean Air Act.
This is an I told you so show. We told you, people!
See, the biggest problem with the whole energy deregulation law is it made the little fella pay for the mistakes of the big fella.
Right.
So, I mean, essentially the utility companies got to charge consumers an extra $10 billion here in Massachusetts to pay for their bad investments in places like Boston Edison built this nuclear power plant down in Plymouth. Well, yeah, they went to sell it and they had about $900 million, almost $1 billion worth of debt. Well, they could only get, I forget, 80 or 90, possibly $100 million on the marketplace. I think it was $100 million. Well, who paid for the extra $800 million? The consumers. That's tacked onto your bill monthly for the next 7 years. So when they started the whole effort, they said, well, we're going to cut the rates by 10% and then open it up to the so-called free market. But free market means a choice. We're not seeing any choice. And so, unfortunately, the economics was a kind of smoke and mirrors. They cut back 10% the first couple of years, and then they tack it on later. You know, they spread a lot of money up on Beacon Hill. And, you know, I used to say that the great bank robber, right? Jesse James, his brother Frank, would have been very proud of what the utility companies pulled off. Because, you know, Jesse and these guys used to have to use the guns, right? And these guys used the pen and the click of the keystroke there with the computer. Bingo. A new law giving them $10 billion, moving money out of our pockets to their pockets. I think, I mean, it's a massive bailout of a very, privately owned business. And, you know, if, let's say your business, right? You own that newspaper stand in Davis Square. Get your papers from this guy, right?
Or else.
Or else. From your Davis Square. Check him out. He's got the best newsstand in the entire T system. The cleanest, the sharpest, the friendliest guy.
Well, that was what John had to say about electric deregulation. He thought the lobbyists paid too much money and got it passed sort of nefariously. John was also big into the reform of health care, and he pushed, he was going to have a ballot initiative, but instead of having, he stopped the ballot initiative because he got the legislators to pass a reform health care. And as a matter of fact, he mentions that in the show. So let's go to see what he has to say about health care.
Every other country in the modern world has health care for all. And they do it for half the cost that we do or less, and people live longer. And people say, what, would I say that again? Every other country, France, Germany, you know, the 30, 40 largest industrialized countries have universal health care where 99.9% of the people are covered. In America, 15% of our people don't have health insurance. And these are working families. 85% of the uninsured are people who work full-time or have a primary income earner that works full-time in their family. People remember that Medicaid, so-called in Massachusetts, Mass Health covers the poorest of the poor, and Medicare covers the senior, but people don't have insurance. It's generally people who are working full-time. Other countries have figured out that if you cover everybody, you actually save money. That, it's like our grandmothers used to say, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. If you go to the doctor's office and you have an insurance plan where you get regular visits covered, it's a lot cheaper than if you find out you have a problem when you have to go to the emergency room. In fact, going to a doctor is
a lot cheaper.
It's 2.5 times more expensive to use the emergency room. If people don't have insurance, they don't go for the regular checkup. So if you had regular checkups, you might detect hypertension, which can lead to congestive heart failure, a heart attack, a stroke, or death, or worse. What's worse than death? What was I saying?
Well, there's supposedly some things are worse than that.
No, I don't know what they are, but I was raised Catholic. They told us when we die, if we had our thing all together, that we're going right to heaven. So the closest country to us is Switzerland, and then they spend about $2,500. But Germany, France, England, Canada, they spend less than us, but they live longer. How do they live longer? Because people are part of regular checkups that detect problems before they turn into major nightmares. So we had a whole healthcare reform effort of the Mass Nurses Association, the whole combination of the unions, the AFL-CIO, the Communication Workers of America, Service Employees, International Union that actually works in the hospitals. You know, gee, we had Healthcare for All, the predominant healthcare reform organization. We had the League of Women Voters. Hey, man, had a League of Women Voters and the union folks and the nurses. The whole thing was really put together by doctors and nurses who decided that the healthcare system was out of control. So we, last year we started a petition drive. We collected close to 100,000 signatures on petitions to make sure that patients have rights when they go into HMOs or hospitals, so that, you don't want, the Tufts Health Plan, which, personally I consider one of the worst. They think they're one of the greatest, but you don't want the bean counter or the accountant at the Tufts Health Plan determining whether or not my mother should get an operation, right, or an MRI or a chest X-ray. You want the doctor or the caregiver making that decision with my mother. And so what Tufts and others were trying to do in this state was to say, no, listen, if we decide that Mrs. O'Connor on average is too old and we don't want to give her fancy tests and treatment, it should be their decision. And we're saying that's ridiculous. Accountants are not licensed to practice medicine. If your doctor decides you need a regime of treatment or care, the decision-making power should be in their hands. The other problem, in terms of the healthcare system bleeding cash out to a special interest is the drug situation. Every other country realizes that when a drug company makes Claritin or Allegra or Prozac, they have an intellectual property right for, 15, 17 years.
Yeah, something like that.
You essentially have a monopoly on that cure for that particular disease. Every other country realizes that if you got monopolies, you need rules so that monopolies don't gouge senior citizens and other folks who they'll gouge. Because, business is set up to make money, and they don't really care about the average.
You can rationalize anything.
Yeah, in fact, we have seniors from New England now traveling up to Canada to buy prescription drugs because they're 50% cheaper.
That's true.
So there's a lot of price gouging. I think the pharmaceutical companies made upwards of $30 billion of profit last year across the country. They're just overcharging people, and government has not responded. Actually today, Blue Cross Blue Shield turns out to be one of our best. See, the good thing still about parts of the Massachusetts medical system, even though it needs to be improved in the healthcare delivery system, is the majority of our HMOs, like Blue Cross Blue Shield, our biggest, is actually not for profit. What that means is that when money is made, it's plowed back into the business. You don't have executives paying themselves
dividends. The
guy from the phone company that's forcing the workers out on strike, he paid himself $28 million last year. Some of the giant for-profit HMOs, Aetna and U.S. Health and others, they pay themselves tens of millions of dollars each year. Well, I know the guy from Tufts is still paying himself $1 million a year, but it's not like sucking out $20 million of healthcare money that could be used to extend coverage to the uninsured. So we do a little better in this state because we have preserved a kind of charitable mentality with our hospitals and our HMOs. We have 62 hospitals. 60 of them are not-for-profit corporations. Well, the one big hospital changed over to a for-profit.
Yeah, it was a Worcester?
Yeah, the old St. Vincent's Hospital. Was bought by the Tennant Corporation. This is, as far as I'm concerned, there's good guys and bad guys. These guys are bad guys. They're involved in something like $400 to $500 million of civil penalties and lawsuits.
Nobody's perfect.
All sorts of terrible things. But the idea is you want your hospitals to remain not-for-profit because
I agree.
If money is made, you want to put back into the care of the patients, and you don't want it being sucked out to wonderful, well-intended shareholders in California, Texas, Brussels, or Paris. You want the money from Mass General to stay in the vicinity and improve that facility. And that's the difference between a not-for-profit hospital, which are most of our hospitals. One of the good things about the new health care reform law that passed this summer that Governor Cellucci signed, and Finneran, Birmingham, everybody was for it down there, was that it set up a process to prevent the conversions of our hospitals to for-profit entities. They can still legally apply, but the hospitals have to show a public benefit in converting hospitals to for-profit, which is very hard to prove. The truth of the matter is you live a lot longer in not-for-profit hospitals. There's been all sorts of studies. Kidney dialysis, you got a kidney problem. you get dialysis in a for-profit institution, you have a 20% higher chance of dying when you're on the kidney dialysis machine compared to not-for-profit institutions. So it's not just idle rhetoric. There is a substantial sort of mortality and substantial differences in terms of death rates and sickness rates, mortality and morbidity rates when you're in a not-for-profit hospital.
Okay, that was what John had to say about healthcare. Now, John was also big into the environment. He had a company called Greenworks, which was it was a company that gave environmental startup companies money so that they could become green. It was called Greenworks, so they could do green things in their company, which means when I say green things, I'm talking about environmentally right types of businesses, so that they could do, different types of electricity, different types of refrigeration, everything, whatever they were doing, whatever somebody had an idea that would be environmentally sound, John would back. And so let's go see what John has to say about the environment too.
Probably one of the most boring topics under the sun, but it does relate to the sun. We could get it from the solar energy if we tried.
Yeah.
If you go down to Porter Square in Somerville now, in Cambridge line, they got 82 solar panels. Fueling that whole shopping center.
That's right.
Invest in alternative energy. We should be phasing in more wind and solar, geothermal. I run a business in Cambridge called Greenworks, and we get, I forget, 20% of our electricity from the rooftop solar panels, turning it directly into electricity. No pollution created there. But as well, we have an underground well. It goes down 84 feet, and the temperature of the ground is a constant 50 degrees. So if you bring that into your building in the summer, you got a great basis for air conditioning. You bring that 50 degrees into the building in winter, if it's 20 degrees out, you only have to move it from 50 to 70. So you save a lot of fuel. And these technologies have been available. Some of them, solar heating particularly, has been available for almost 100 years in this country. Geothermal was developed by the Swedes, where they put these, they're called ground source heat pumps, these wells underground that pump in a constant 50-degree temperature. The alternatives are there. If, particularly on a state level, if our government really holds to encouraging investment in this area, I think we can do a lot to both create jobs, clean up the environment, but at the same time, I think in the long run, lower the price of energy, because more and more we're relying on foreign oil in this country.
And gas,
it's creating this greenhouse effect. I heard the polar ice caps were actually breaking up because the Earth is getting warmer. Before you know it, we're, Somerville, Boston, we're underwater here.
That's right.
That little part of Somerville.
Well, I get beachfront property in 30 years, 100 years.
See that? You'll be on the beach soon. You just stay where you are in Somerville and get into your neighborhood. Anyhow, but the point is, we have safer, cleaner energy alternatives.
They said we're going to get green power. I mean, I haven't noticed anybody in my neighborhood putting up a solar panel because they said there's going to be all this money to help with solar panels. Well, they got, the Swift administration has money. They haven't spent one nickel on solar panels for working class neighborhoods. And, all that stuff would work, but the average Joe cannot afford, $15,000, $20,000 to put the solar stuff on his roof.
No.
But if they're, if the state took that couple $100 million that they're going to have and made it available in low interest loans to people, and you could say, hey, if I put that on my roof, I could lower my electric bill. It would pay for itself over 15, 20 years. It's affordable. But instead, they're hoarding the cash, and they say they're going to, allow,
It would also be a resale feature.
Be a resale feature. Actually, they got solar panels now you can put on as roof tiles, and it's much better roofing material. So you turn sunlight into electricity, and you don't have to replace the roof except for 50 years down the road instead of every 15, 20 years, whatever people have to do now. So. There's all sorts of advantages, but you do need some credit instruments, and the state, under the Swift administration, has been terrible at letting that money available for everyday people. They're sitting on, I think, close to $150 million now.
Well, that was John, and like I say, John passed away, unfortunately, before his time. I have to say it again. I really thought John was a great person. He also thought that the politicians in this state were, not that he thought that they were on the take, but they went wherever the lobbyists pointed them. And unfortunately, he probably was right.
It's a complex subject, but if you could summarize electric deregulation, one word, robbery. 2 words, highway robbery.
Highway robbery.
They stole.
Yeah.
I mean, basically, you have a 100-year-old monopoly.
Right.
They have put cash in every politician's hands. we couldn't get anybody. Actually, one mayor then, Michael Capuano, now the congressman, actually came out against us, and God bless him for doing that. That was a great thing. But I tell you, the Democrats, the Republicans, you know, Governor Weld, Governor Cellucci, now Governor Swift, they're all in the pockets of the giant utility companies. So the energy giants, including the big oil and gas companies, people don't even realize that
well, they're all one now.
The oil companies own the 6 largest gas companies, and the 7 largest oil companies merged into the 3 largest. You know, Mobil and Exxon got back together. Now they were separated, I think 90 years ago. That they used to be Standard Oil, and antitrust laws. They had such a monopoly. The federal government broke them up. They're back together again.
Exactly.
But that whole energy deregulation thing was a robbery. It was written by the energy companies, of for and by, not the people, but of for and by the energy companies. They spent a lot of cash on this. They probably spent close to $20 million. We know they spent over $10 million in the campaign. We, you know, some of us, Ed Kelly, who passed away just the last year, God rest his soul, and I, and teams of volunteers across the state, we collected upwards of 100,000 signatures to say, look, the public ought to have a right to say yay or nay to this. Because while the energy company said it was going to lower prices, it was going to bring on competition, we'd have, you know, solar energy and wind power and clean electricity, they promised us everything. They said the only problem was that there's going to be so many electric, if you will, competitors calling you at dinner that your dinner was going to be interrupted because people are going to be calling you up, offering you lower electric rates. Well, what's happened? You know, that passed in '97. The bill is about this big. They handed it out 45 minutes before the debate started. So people didn't even have time to read it, because when you read a law like that, you got to read all the laws that change.
And you gotta understand all the
Very
language.
few people even knew what was in there, and basically what it did was it moved about $6 or $7 billion out of the hands of everyday consumers. There's a charge on your electric bill called a transition charge, but it gave the electric light companies $6 billion to pay for their bad investments in the nuclear power plants and these old coal-fired plants that don't work and pollute. It essentially took the rules away so that the electricity producers could charge anything they want.
That's right.
Now, in the past, because this is a natural monopoly, government has always said, look, you can only get your cost of production plus a little profit. Because if you only have one choice to buy electricity, you know, the government has to make sure that the big fella, the Rockefeller, isn't stealing from the little fella.
That's right.
And so we've always had regulation in phones and electricity and these natural monopolies because, in fact, you know, there isn't much competition. So
there isn't any, actually.
Let's look at the claims. They said if we just took the rules off of those giant monopolies, that suddenly there'd be competition. It would be a fine idea if there was real competition. But you can't deregulate a market and still have a monopoly in charge of it. Because that's just robbery. That's thievery. That's just stealing from the rich and the poor. These guys are equal opportunity thieves. They take from everybody. You wonder why we're going into some form of an economic decline or perhaps a recession. All the money's going out to the energy companies.
Especially
record profits. You know, ExxonMobil, who actually sells the oil and the gas to the electric light companies, record up 500%. Basically, under this new deregulation plan, we turn all the powers over to the energy giants. They can charge what they want. There's no price rules. When there's a monopoly, you either break up the monopolies and have real competition, which we never did under energy deregulation, or you have rules and regulations so that anytime they try to jam you with a rate increase, you know, elected officials or appointed officials can determine whether or not we're getting, you know, robbed or pillaged or plundered.
Well, seems to be
and so it can't work. Look, the rates have gone up 50 to 70%. Part of the solution to these problems is, we need rules on these private monopolies to make sure that they don't gouge consumers. But we also should examine the 40 towns in Massachusetts that have publicly owned utilities. Because their prices are 20 to 30 to 40% cheaper, and they do a lot more by way of conservation on alternative energy. See, if you're NSTAR or you're Mass Electric, you have no incentive to reduce the use of electricity. You sell electricity, so why would you want to, you know, use compact fluorescent light bulbs that might reduce your electric bill? You don't want to give those light bulbs out because people will end up paying less to the electric light company. Well, if you're publicly owned, you know, you and I will own the thing. We might live here in Somerville or Cambridge. We would own the thing, and so we could vote to have everybody use fuel-efficient light bulbs. So conservation seems to work better. Solar energy, wind, all those exotic technologies, they work better when it's a publicly owned utility, because there's an incentive to reduce the amount of electricity. And with a publicly owned facility, the city council, as bad as they can be in different communities, they're not price gougers. They're not going to try to stiff the little guy generally, because they got to, you know, they get voted in the ward. So, you know, ward leader sees the electric bill go up 40%. They say, hey, we're getting somebody in there who's going to fight for lower electric rates. So there is a mechanism to democratically control energy. Even, you know, the founders of the country, you go back and read Franklin and Jefferson and Samuel Adams and John Adams, a lot of their fights were against giant monopolies. You know, the king had the monopoly on the tea, the king had the monopoly on all the imports and the exports. That's true. There were food riots in Somerville and all the Boston neighborhoods during the American Revolution because there was a few monopolists that were hoarding the sugar. You go back and read the history. You know, the history of this country is rich in terms of taking on these privately owned monopolies and making sure they're held publicly accountable.
One thing that's sort of, you know, you look at the Republicans now and you say, gee, you know, they're the party of whatever you want to call them, right? I don't go into the party of the rich stuff because there's more millionaires in the Democratic Party than the
Equal opportunity millionaires, they buy both parties now.
Exactly. I also saw you at the convention and you gave quite a stirring speech.
Oh my God, nobody was listening, come on.
Well, I was.
I was talking about democracy.
I was, for the last 2 years, I've gone as a delegate to the, from Ward 6.
Well, very interestingly, I was asked to help come up with an issues agenda for the Democratic Party, particularly as the leadership in Washington, you know, George Bush said he was going to be a conservationist. He turns out to be a conversationalist. There's so much hot air coming out of his mouth on the environment. Yeah, he's a conversationalist, a lot of talk. The whole Democratic convention was really to try to sketch the difference between what it means to be Democrat, what it means to be Republican in this age. And you know, I'm a Democrat, but I tell you, the Democrats are susceptible to the same sort of big money in politics.
Oh, without a doubt.
To run in an election in this day and age, unless you're a zillionaire, you cannot afford to do anything but suck up to the big guys from the same companies Republicans do it.
I don't buy into that. You know.
So I don't think we're much better. I think there is a difference though on issues of education, healthcare, women's right to choose, and other things. But I tell you, this big money is destroying the Democratic Party. It's already captured the Republican Party. But
and I'm not advocating anything for George Wallace or before or after, but the one thing he said that I agreed with, he said there ain't a dime's worth of difference between a Democrat and a Republican. And you know, I've always felt that way.
There's probably 10 cents worth of difference. But that's about it. That doesn't buy you a lot this month. Well, I'm still Democratic because ultimately I think we've been the party of sticking up for the working man, making sure that there's a safety net under capitalism so that children and elderly don't fall through. But we got to get much better at taking on the drug companies and the electric light monopolies and the oil companies.
I think most of us will miss John. There are a lot of people out there that know him a lot better than I do, so they'll probably miss him a lot more. But I think, like I say once more, that his words should be heeded, and people should listen to what he had to say, even though he's gone. And they should listen to what he has to say, because what he said then will probably be pertinent for the next 5 or 10 years anyway. He was a leader in trying to do the right thing, and unfortunately he's no longer here. I guess I'll see you at the next West End video newsletter.